You may remember in my introductory lecture I used that very short text, just a page or two of manuscript, called The Birth Tale of Cuchulainn, to illustrate the nature of the material that forms part and parcel of these series of lectures. And in that story, which on the face of it was a story about the conception and birth of the mythical hero, there was also, as you may recall, an allusion to contemporary concerns like the introduction of clientship, that reciprocal relationship between king and subordinate. But then there were, in a richly textured short text, there were also various mythic themes embedded that would have been very familiar and would have resonated with the medieval audience in ways that we can only dimly apprehend, I think. The mother of Cuchulainn Dechtra was, in effect, a sovereignty goddess, a goddess of the land and prosperity. Concobar himself was a sacred king, which introduces, of course, the concept of sacral kingship. And there were also allusions to the otherworld and indeed to solar imagery. And these are the four themes we'll be chasing more or less in these lectures, and in this lecture and these lectures to come. This lecture this morning is slightly unusual. I was going to say slightly weirder than the others, but in fact it has two very distinct but separate parts to it. In the first, we'll be taking a look at the archaeology and the associated mythology of the celebrated Boyne Valley. But in the second part, I'll range more widely and try and address that critical question that O'Kelly asked when he published his excavations at Newgrange. Is it possible that beliefs and practices of the Neolithic before 2000 BC could survive in an oral tradition for all those centuries, to be eventually embedded, albeit in an attenuated form, in medieval manuscript of the 7th or 8th centuries AD. And you can well imagine that people who are familiar with Chinese whispers and how, in fact, stories can be utterly transmuted over a relatively short period of time would be skeptical about this claim. But I think a case can be made, as you'll see. The celebrated Boyne Valley probably deserves no introduction. It's, as you know, a great complex of passage tombs situated in the great bend of the river between Slane and Drogheda in County Meath. And the term Brúna Boinne, the Otherworld Hall of the Boyne, is today applied to the complex as a whole, at least in the tourist literature, but in fact the name should more properly be applied, it would seem, to the great mound of Newgrange itself. And Newgrange and Dowth and Dowth are in their own ways surrounded by other important and smaller monuments. But a simplified map like this gives no true indication of the sheer complexity of this landscape, because more recent surveys there have demonstrated, several Cursus monuments, more henge monuments, and other burial mounds. So this is a very complex bend of the river. It's a landscape with a very long biography, and these ancient pedigrees, if you like, are part and parcel of the story, not just of the Boyne Valley, but of the royal sites like Rathcroghan, Tara, and Armagh. The famous tombs, now Newgrange and Dowth, are simply, if you like, the culmination of a process of development in which eventually the great monuments display a greater interest in display and visibility and in art and architecture. I suppose there's no need to describe these monuments in any detail, but I'd like to emphasize just one particular aspect at this stage. Today, the great mound at Dowth, thanks to George Oaken's extraordinary campaign of excavation, is now known to be an extraordinarily complicated site with an enormous amount of later medieval settlement and some Iron Age activity attested there as well. As you can see in the illustration on the lower left, and I mentioned this yesterday, the great mound at Dowth has this very carefully stratified construction, alternating layers of stone and earth. And this is just one of the significant differences between it and the mound at Newgrange, as we'll see. Medieval activity is also attested at Dowth, and while no modern excavation has taken place there, the fact that souterrains these underground storage chambers of the early medieval period are attached to at least one of the known passage tombs there, is an indication that it too, like Nowth, was the focus of activity in the early centuries of the first millennium AD. These two monuments in this fashion with the medieval activity stand in stark contrast to Newgrange, but they too have their mythological associations. Nowth is described as the cave of Nowth and an entrance to the Otherworld in a 12th century text, and a statement in that place lore that Aonghus equates it with a certain goddess called Bui, who may or may not be one of the wives of the great god Lu. But the scraps of mythology here are, I think, perhaps not as revealing as the scraps of mythology associated with two other great mounds. Equinoctial alignments have been claimed for the tombs at Nowth, but again, these are doubtful. However, at Dowth itself, solar ritual has been suggested. And that is interesting because it has been claimed that the setting sun in winter illuminates the interior of the southernmost of these. So if that's the case, we have in fact solar activity associated not necessarily with Nowth, but with Dowth and with Newgrange as well. O'Kelly's excavations at Newgrange began in the early 1960s. And to be fair, they produced the first accurate plan of this monument and much detail about its construction, its art, and indeed its architecture. The Great Mound is 85 metres across, and in contrast to Nowth, it consists of a great cairn of water-rolled stones, as we'll see later on. And thanks to radiocarbon dating, we now know that the mound, the tomb at Newgrange, was built over 5,000 years ago, before 3000 BC. Excavation revealed that a considerable amount of material had collapsed from the mound, including a fair amount of quartz around the entrance to the tomb. And O'Kelly believed that this material had once stood as a sort of a great upright wall, giving the original Newgrange a sort of drum-shaped construction. And this is what the visitor sees today, as you can see, a great quartz facade fronting and enclosing a grass-covered cairn of stones. This construction is controversial. It has been suggested that perhaps the quartz and indeed the other stones found in the collapse around the front of the tomb in particular may originally have been a sort of platform in front of the tomb rather than this great sort of rather intimidating facade. And while O'Kelly believed Newgrange to be a single period monument, it's now been recognized that there are various turf lines in the cairn that might suggest a degree of multi-periodization. And while it may have been, you know, the result of a complicated and rather prolonged process of enlargement, perhaps spanning several hundreds of years. His discovery of what was called the roof box above the entrance to the tomb was one of the more noteworthy finds of his excavation program. It indicated that the curb of the mound had turned inwards at this point to give access to this feature above the entrance to the monument. Basically, this roof box is formed by a gap between the first two roof slabs of the passage. And as perhaps you can barely see there below the quartz, the roof stone of the roof box itself is decorated with sort of engraved designs. And here we come to one of the features of the tomb and of O'Kelly's excavations that has certainly captured the popular imagination, and that is the famous solstice phenomenon. As is well known, at dawn, at the midwinter solstice, if the weather permits, on the shortest day of the year, the rays of the rising sun shine through the roof box and illuminate briefly the chamber. In fact, the spectacle occurs for just over a week before and after the solstice. And I remember O'Kelly telling me that when he was standing in the chamber alone, which he thought was a fairly eerie experience, because occasionally the mound would, the cairn of stones would move and growl, and you felt you were in a strange and otherworldly place, that he was so moved when he saw the sun doing its, making its entrance, that he burst into tears. And it is, I think, worth remembering that for the inhabitants of Newgrange all those years ago, this too was a mystical experience. And indeed for some of the visitors today, I think it has that particular effect. Complex rituals obviously took place when this extraordinary event occurred. And these probably occurred within and without the tomb. My colleague Stefan Berg has observed that these solar rituals denote a certain knowledge that was probably the preserve of a minority. And this minority, in their ability to predict these celestial events, appeared to control time. They were probably the original Time Lords, if you follow me. And also, a site like Newgrange was a monument of secrets. The rituals were based on mystery and on secret knowledge, and this is a theme I'll return to. When O'Kelly, as I mentioned before, published his book on the Newgrange excavations, he had to confront the fact that it figures prominently in early Irish mythology. He pointed out that in medieval tradition, the Otherworld, Hall of the Boyne, Brúna Boine, was the dwelling place of the great god, the Dagda, and his son Aonghus. It was also later on appropriated by the early kings of Tara as their legendary burial place. O'Kelly mentions that this god, the Dagda, and Aonghus are both mentioned in a tale called The Wooing of Athene, in which it is said that the Brú, Newgrange, belonged to a certain Elkma, who was married to Boand, the goddess of the river. And he thought it possible that Newgrange's association with the chief of the gods, the Dagda, and his son, Aonghus, was one reason for the enduring sanctity of the monument, because, as we know, it was a place where offerings were made in Iron Age, in Roman times. And he wondered if there was any connection between one of the traditional attributes of the Dagda as a sun god and the yearly visitation of the sun to the tomb. And he asked the question, well, I think he asked it rather mischievously, can it have been the builders of the Boyne tombs who planted the first seeds of Irish oral literature? And should one begin to think of this literature not as a window on the Iron Age, and you remember Kenneth Jackson's publication, but as a window on the late Neolithic? In effect, he was asking that critical question. Could some of the elements of the beliefs and practices of these Neolithic people before 2000 BC have survived all those years to be eventually embedded in medieval tradition? The mythological associations of the Boyne tombs, Dowth and Newgrange in particular, were pursued in an innovative paper in 1990 by the Celtic scholar John Carey. And I'll briefly run through the three texts that he studied and the allusions to certain activities identified therein. In a tale called The Taking of the Otherworld Mound, the Dagda, his name, by the way, means the good god in the sense of good at everything, and he's also called Uchi ul Ahar, the great father. He distributes the otherworld mounds amongst his followers, and he keeps Newgrange for himself. The account runs, there was a famous king over the Tuatha Dé Danann in Ireland. His name was Dagon. Great then was his power, even though it belonged to the Macmillan after the conquest of the country. For the Tuatha Dé Danann destroyed the corn and the milk around the Macmillan until they made the friendship of the Dagda. Afterwards he saved their corn and milk. Now, when he was king at first, his might was vast, and it was he who apportioned out the she-mounds to the men of the Tuatha Dé, namely Lugmac Ethna in she Rodrubawn and Ogma in she Archaeology, and so on and so on. In other words, he distributed various otherworldly mounds, perhaps passage tombs, to various individuals. He gives nothing to his son, the mock-og Aonghus, who comes to petition for a mound for himself. I have none for thee, said the Dagda, I have completed the division. Therefore, let it be granted to me, said the mock Og, even a day and a night in thine own dwelling. Then that was given to him. Go now to thy following, said the Dagda, since thou hast consumed thy allotted time. It is clear, said he, that night and day are the length of the whole world, and that is what has been given to me. Night and day are the whole world is the crucial phrase in this. In short, Aonghus tricks the incumbent of Newgrange with magical words and the manipulation of time. He extends a single day into all eternity. There's a different version given in that tale, The Wooing of 18, that O'Kelly referred to. And here, in this 9th century text, we learn that Aonghus was conceived by the Dagda with the goddess Boyne. And this is an important relationship in the story as well. She was also the wife of Elkmar, also called Nectan. These things can be somewhat complicated. And you'll be glad to know the sex does continually figure in all of this. So, I mean, there are momentary references to other activities in later lectures. I was advised yesterday not to tell you precisely when, but to keep you in suspense as to when this happens. You know, I mean, but here again, you can see that Aonghus was conceived and born in the one day, and he was begotten at the break of day and born betwixt it and evening. In other words, his conception and gestation and birth all took place in the one day. And basically, in this tale, Elkmar occupies the brew, and the Dagda tells Aonghus how to deceive him into yielding possession. And once again, a crucial phrase occurs, for it is in days and nights that the world is spent. Carey was able to point out that here we have an illustration of the manipulation of time, basically. And in another tale, called The Fosterage of the Two Vessels, something similar occurs. This is a very convoluted story, and Aonghus once again gains Newgrange, the brew, by placing this particular Elkmar under an enchantment that will last until the end of time. And the phrase again is, until heaven and earth are mingled together, until the sun and moon are mingled together. Carey took these very scraps of evidence and placed them all together. And he noted that there was a common theme. Aonghus wins Newgrange through the power of the word, through verbal dexterity or magic. And significantly, this involves, as I've said, the manipulation of time. And this manipulation of time is also a feature of the scraps of mythology associated with nearby Dowth. Well, once again, as I said a moment ago, we have some evidence of solar phenomena. At Dowth, it is in the place lore, the metrical Dinhanicus, that we get an explanation for the name of Dowth, which in ancient literature is She Mrazel, the Otherworld mound, or Otherworld hall of someone called the Bressel. And this Bressel is credited with the building of the great mound. And once again, the manipulation of time occurs. His sister came to him and told him that she would stay the sun's course in the vault of heaven, so they might have an endless day to accomplish the task. In short, she casts a spell that fixes the sun in the sky, so that a day and night might last indefinitely. And here things go slightly awry. Bressel lustfully commits incest with her, and the spell is broken and the sun departs. And since the construction of the work has been darkened, Rodubed, darkening is said to be the name of the mound. So again, you get a sort of fanciful explanation for the name of Dowth in this place lore. But critically, you see once again the manipulation of time. And Carey thinks that this is a remarkable coincidence, that basically these legends should reflect control over time, and that archaeological excavations have revealed this solar ritual at Newgrange. And like O'Kelly, he asked the question, could tales recorded in medieval times echo the beliefs of Neolithic tomb builders all those millennia before? We'll have to address this problem, as I said. But first, the mythology of the River Boyne. And this has been, as far as I can see, not addressed by O'Kelly or anybody else. And while it's generally thought that modest, smaller tombs probably represented the sanctification of the landscape before the great passage tombs were built, I think it's more likely that the river itself, the sacred River Boyne, was what made this area of County Meath consecrated ground. The river's mythical beginnings are extraordinary. The prose Din Hanachas, place lore, records the creation of the river at its source at a well near Carberry Hill, the Well of Nechthan in County Kildare. This well is now called Trinity Well, and it can be visited to this day. The goddess Boand, the wife of Nechthan, went to the secret well, which was in the green of Nechthan. Whoever went to it would not come from it without his two eyes bursting, unless it were Nechthan himself and his 3 cupbearers. And once upon a time, Boand, the goddess, went through pride to test the well's power and declared that it had no secret force which could shatter her form, and thrice she walked with her shins anti-clockwise around the well, whereupon 3 waves break from the well over her and deprive her of a thigh and one of her hands and one of her eyes. Then she, fleeing her shame, turns seaward, with the water behind her as far as the Boyne mouth, where she was drowned. Now she was the mother of Aonghus, son of the Dagda. It's a very strange tale indeed. And that great scholar of comparative mythology, Georges Dumézil, was very taken by it. And he identified a relationship between this story of the creation of the Boyne and a myth in Indo-Iranian tradition. And he was struck by such strange parallels at either end of the Indo-European world. And he thought this was a situation that precluded any possibility of horizontal transmission. In other words, he argued that we were looking at Indo-European inheritances at either end of this great geographical span. Dumézil identified the story of Apam Napat in the Rig Veda as a parallel text. Here several verses refer to a water god with that name, Apam Napat, and to the themes of fire in the water. For example, the shining waters enclose the bright and shining Apam Napat. With bright flames, he shines richly among us in the waters, without needing kindling fuel and clothed in ghee. In Iranian tradition, in the Avesta, Apam Napat has similar associations as a guardian of a lake containing the Svarna, a brilliant light of glory that is the symbol of royal power. And various attempts to seize this forbidden prize caused the lake to overflow, creating several rivers, one of which continues to guard the divine light. In short, the Rig Veda and Apam Napat, therein is a water divinity who emits a brilliant burning force. He's associated basically with fire and water, as I said. In the Iranian Avesta, he has similar associations in a lake containing the brilliant light of glory. Now, it's true, the Irish tale contains no mention of a fiery essence in Nechthan's well. But it does allude to the bursting of a forbidden visitor's eyes. And Dumézil argued that there must have been some force in the well of Nechthan to burst a wrongdoer's eyes in this fashion. And he saw this as, he saw this as one of the common traits to be found in various Indo-European mythologies. It was the American scholar Patrick Ford who very ingeniously proposed that the force in the well of Nechthan that caused such havoc was the illuminating brilliance of wisdom. And he cites several instances where wells are described as a source of knowledge, including a tract where the waters of Segas, another name for the Boyne that flows from the well of Nechthan, had a hazel tree growing there above them, and the nuts that fell therein furnished the mastery of knowledge and poetry, whoever drank the waters there. So there are several interesting shared themes here in the Indo-Iranian and Irish traditions. There's a a burning or a brilliant element hidden in water, and this constituent is attainable only by those who are qualified and is forbidden to those who are not. 3 attempts are made to retrieve the light of glory, and Boand circles the well 3 times in an inauspicious direction, and her illegitimate attempts to claim the element result in the overflowing of the waters. And the river itself clearly has associations with secret knowledge. And if it seems likely, the story of the origins of the Boyne is part of an Indo-European tradition, then the sanctity of the river and its particular association with mystery and knowledge is of great antiquity indeed. On another level, the name of the river, originally Bu Vinda, is generally considered to mean the river of the cow-white goddess, and a similar compound occurs in Sanskrit as Govinda, reflecting, it's believed, the prestige of cattle in both Indian and Irish tradition. And while the bovine element is not in doubt in the name of the Boyne, it is possible that the Vind element derives from an Indo-European form meaning knowledge or discovery. So we're back again to the association of the river with secret knowledge. But there may be another dimension to this mythology as well, because the goddess Boand, you remember, gave birth to Aonghus. She was in effect the creator of the owner of Newgrange. And here we return briefly to archaeology, because as I've mentioned already, the difference between Dowth and Newgrange in the construction of the mound is intriguing. O'Kelly discovered that the great cairn at Newgrange itself was composed of water-rolled stones, essentially taken from the bed of the River Boyne some distance away. Something like 200,000 tons of rounded stony material were used to construct this cairn, and it had to be all transported from the river about a kilometre away. O'Kelly thought that a rather strange sort of water-filled feature, it's arrowed in the illustration on the lower left there, might have been the source of this material, but in fact it seems much more likely that the exposed riverbank of the river, and indeed the riverbed, was the source of this water-rolled material. In more recent years, petrological studies have been undertaken of the great curbstones and orthostats in the monument. These, for the most part, if not in their entirety, are of a form of sandstone called greywacke. And this recent work illustrates that the likely source for this constructional material, the curbstones and the orthostats, is a source on the coast to the north at Clogherhead, where this stone, interestingly enough, outcrops in a liminal situation on the seashore. If this is true, it seems most likely then that the great stones of the tomb were transported by water southwards along the coast for some 10 kilometres to the mouth of the river, and then perhaps again transported by raft up the river for some 30 kilometres to Newgrange itself. Now, if this was the case, the river played a fundamentally important part in the construction of the monument. It provided both the cairn stones and the curbstones and the orthostats. And it's possible that the creative role that the river played is reflected in the story of the goddess Boand being the mother of Aonghus, the incumbent of the tomb itself. In other words, once again, in addition to those allusions to secret knowledge and the manipulation of time, the creation of the monument may in fact be encapsulated in some of the mythic elements that we've summarized. And who knows, I mean, maybe that famous triple spiral that you see on the left-hand orthostat, instead of being a sun symbol, might indeed be a reference to the 3 waves, those catastrophic waves that produced the Boyne River itself. The river's magical role, I think, is not in doubt. It was a source of esoteric wisdom, and it was this wisdom that was the source of power of the inhabitants, of the incumbents of Newgrange. Now to the question, could tales recorded in medieval times really echo in some way the story of the tomb itself and some of the beliefs of the people who practiced the rituals there millennia before? The longevity of potent myths anchored to a monument, an enduring monument like Newgrange, is not surprising. Enduring monuments like this could well have been the focus for the preservation of beliefs in a pre-literate society, just as the myths in the place lore survived for many generations. Julian Thomas has observed, writing of some monuments in southwest Scotland, that durable monuments, principally those composed of earth and stone, had a mnemonic capacity. Their continued presence and reuse brought the past into the present, and this is fair enough. The reuse of megalithic tombs could have, of course, have been an important factor in the retention and transmission of tradition, to use Stuart Pickett's phrase. It may have been a widespread phenomenon, but it's not one easily recognized in the archaeological record. Iron Age usage is sometimes attested, and here in Scotland, one wonders if some of the Iron Age activity identified by Richard Hingley reflects occult activity in sort of Neolithic monuments. In Ireland, there is a fair amount of evidence for Iron Age activity on Neolithic sites like these. But it's fair to say too, of course, that Iron Age usage does not necessarily imply continued usage throughout prehistory. Just to cite one example of Iron Age usage in Ireland, in County Fermanagh there's a passage tomb. The tomb is more or less destroyed, but some stones survive. That was obviously remodeled in the Iron Age. A ditch was cut around the Neolithic mound, and then a bank consisting of 18 or 19 small Iron Age burial mounds was built outside the ditch, mimicking the nature of an Iron Age ring barrow. And various cremations and finds such as fibulae confirm the Iron Age date. But of course, Iron Age use could have many explanations. People may have been reinventing themselves time again and claiming older monuments for various reasons. But there's one outstanding Irish instance of continuous usage. And this was identified by Billy O'Brien in a small and utterly nondescript megalithic tomb in the townland of Alter near Scull in West Cork some years ago. Excavation at Alter, and indeed some of the other tombs in this area of West Cork, have been most unproductive. There was a little evidence of burial found here. Some cremated bone of an adult human and a single unburnt tooth were recovered. No artifacts were found, no copper, no bronze, no beak or pottery. And at first glance, these results might be considered utterly unpromising. But Billy O'Brien engaged in a program of radiocarbon dating of a whole series of carefully selected organic samples. And these produced truly extraordinary results in my estimation. We have at Alter, in this unprepossessing small tomb, a remarkable depositional sequence. The unburnt tomb, the unburnt tooth was dated to around 2000 BC. That would be the expected date for a monument such as this. Charcoal from a small pit near the center of the chamber was dated to between 1250 and 832 BC, and seems to indicate some depositional activity, which included perhaps the offering of food or some other perishables. Charcoal found near the rear of the chamber provided some slightly later dates of 998 to 560 BC and a date of 766 to 404 BC. More charcoal from a small pit on the south side of the chamber was dated to the period 356 BC to AD 68. And there was a deposition of periwinkle and limpet shells inside the entrance of later date, 2 BC AD to 230 AD. And then finally, a pit in the center of the chamber contained various deposits of shells and fish bones, periwinkle and limpet and wrasse and eel, and 3 dates for the upper fill place some of this activity in the 2nd century AD. The initial ritual sequence at Alter seems to have involved just the deposition of token deposits of human remains. But then there perhaps followed the placing of food offerings, including fish and shellfish. And this seems to have figured prominently. And there seems to be here evidence that this was regarded as a sacred place over a remarkably long span of time. and events that took place within the chamber may, as O'Brien has suggested, have been activities that mediated with the other world over this long durée. To revert to Newgrange, it will be remembered that it remained inviolate in the early medieval period, and while it had demonstrably a sacred role in Iron Age times as the focal place of offerings, people seem to think that this absence of activity reflects, if you like, inactivity. In my estimation, Newgrange remained inviolate because it was the continued focus of ceremonial ritual veneration of one sort or another. And this may have continued well into medieval times. There's an extraordinary reference in the annals of Tirnach in the 11th century. And it simply refers to a great pestilence that occurred in that year, which killed a fourth of the men of Ireland, and it began in the south and spread throughout the four quarters of Ireland. And it was caused by demons who came out of the Northern Isles, to wit 3 battalions. And in each battalion there were 30 and 1,000 and 2,000, and so forth. That's a fantastic explanation for a plague. But Aonghus Og, the son of the Dagda, related to one Gilla Lugan, who used to haunt the fairy mound every Halloween. In other words, there was an individual in the 11th century who used to commune with Aonghus, the son of the Dagda, at the great feast of Samhain at Newgrange, half a millennium after the introduction of Christianity. And it is clear that in the 11th century, some of the old gods were obviously still acknowledged. Even more noteworthy is the suggestion that this Gilla Lugan was a regular and persistent visitor to the Otherworld mound at Samhain. Now, whether his visits involved entering the tomb, we simply do not know. But obviously Newgrange had retained its potent magic until the 11th century. It seems likely that the great mounds associated myths may have been told and retold, reshaped and developed over many generations, but they retained the fundamentally important elements that reflected its sacred beginnings that we have summarized. And this may have been the case at Tara too, where again you have evidence of ancient pedigree in this landscape. On Tara, if you stood, let us say, in the 1st century BC on the Mound of the Hostages and looked to the north, you'd have in fact looking at a cemetery of burial mounds. It was a veritable necropolis. The 3 large mounds that you can see in the left-hand side of the LiDAR image, one is called Rathcroghan. It's a great Iron Age burial mound. But then there are the 2 sloping trenches that I mentioned in the previous lecture that are great ring barrows, again, on the sloping western side of the hill. But these would only have been the 3 most visible sites because, as I mentioned, geophysical survey there has demonstrated mound after mound interconnected one with the other. Now, if the dates of these various mounds to the north of the Mound of the Hostages spanned even 1 or even 2 millennia, then a visitor to Tara at the dawn of the Christian era would have confronted a landscape peopled by a mix of mythical and historical personages. Some of the more recent burial mounds could be attributed, obviously, to people still remembered in living memory, because there was a significant appreciation, obviously, of genealogical time. And this would have extended back several generations into mythical time. It's fair to say that most people think that the conception of a historical past was probably constrained in such pre-literate societies. And indeed, Richard Bradley, in his The Past in Prehistoric Societies in 2002, he and others have pointed out that in such societies, the recollection of a real person or a historical event would survive in popular memory, possibly for just 2 or 3 centuries at most. And then the individual would be assimilated to their mythical model, such as a hero. And an event might be altered into a category such as a mythical action, a fight with a monster. However, It doesn't always follow that oral tradition becomes unstable or corrupt within a few hundred years. And this, I think, is an interesting point that we can now make with some confidence, because there's a fascinating study in some pages of a recent American antiquity. And this takes us far away from the Boyne Valley and from Tara. This is a study of the Tlingit people of southeastern Alaska, where their oral tradition was first recorded in the early 20th century. And their oral tradition included tales such as the first war in the world. This was a story about a memorable early battle that was recorded first in 1904. And these events, like the first war in the world, that battle, and settlements and topographical features are all recorded in their oral traditions in this Dundas Bay region of southern Alaska. Geological studies have determined that the area here was available for settlement by the Tlingit on the glacial sediments at the front of the quiescent glacier shortly after AD 1000. Then the various features of this landscape and the Tlingit settlements were engulfed by the advancing ice age during the following Little Ice Age. The ice then began to retreat sometime before AD 1794. And recent decades have seen the identification of settlements and features referred to in Tlingit oral tradition. Excavation of a settlement there, for example, associated with that celebrated conflict, the first war in the world, demonstrated that it was probably founded around 1150 AD and vacated several centuries later as the ice advanced. In short, in this area of southern Alaska, it's been possible to establish a correlation between oral tradition and landscape changes and settlement. And even though some chronological inconsistencies occur in oral narratives, there are possibly several battles conflated into that First War of the World story. The authors of this report judge oral tradition here to be robustly historical, to use their words, for 850 years. And among the factors that probably contributed to this historical conservatism are the role their traditions played in maintaining group identities, in perpetuating rights to land and resources, and indeed in structuring social interaction. 850 years is getting pretty close to 1,000. And I think that here we can now begin to sort of, with a little greater confidence, assume that the monuments and landscapes of the Boyne Valley, for example, were also the subjects of numerous oral narratives that had a long time span, perhaps long enough to eventually find their way in attenuated form into medieval stories. Archaeology actually lends some support to this, and here where we move into an entirely different direction. One of the great cosmological concerns of the medieval world is expressed in a tale called The Voyage of the Ikara, one of these voyage tales. It's one of the 12th century in medieval Ireland. It's a tale of the sea voyage of three brothers off the coast of the west of Ireland, who, when looking at the setting sun in the Atlantic, asked the fundamental question: where does the sun go when he goes under the sea? And this is a question that also figures in the 9th century text in Teanga Bit Nua, the ever-new tongue. This has been studied by John Carey, who I've mentioned already. This is an apocryphal text in which the spirit of the Apostle Philip, whose tongue was cut out 9 times and 9 times miraculously regenerated. It's surprising what you learn when you have to pursue these mythical elements. Philip addresses the wise men of Jerusalem to explain the creation of the world to them. And here we are told that on the 4th day of creation, God made the fiery circuit of the sun, which illuminates 12 planes beneath the edges of the world in its shining every night. And portions of the message of St. Philip, the ever-new tongue, run as follows: it is thus the sun goes every evening First it shines on the stream beyond the sea, bringing it news of the waters in the east. Then it shines at night upon the lofty sea of fire, and so on and so on. In fact, the sequence is a very long one. But you'll note the phrase, at one point the sun shines upon the flocks of birds who sing many songs together in the valley of the flowers. Carey points out that this allusion, like some others in the tale, are probably comparable to the marvels of the Otherworld in Irish tradition, while others obviously arise from Gnostic writing in late antique Egypt. But once again in this tale, we have a preoccupation with where does the sun go at night. And this belief in the nocturnal voyage of the sun had a long ancestry in prehistoric Europe. The Nordic Bronze Age has an exceptional iconographic repertoire on stone and bronze. And very briefly, when you run through it, you'll see that this belief in the nocturnal voyage of the sun is echoed there thousands of years before Philip and the three lads in the voyage of the Ikara expressed similar concerns in medieval Ireland. Various commentators in Scandinavia, as you know, have expressed, have suggested that there's a complex solar cosmology reflected in this various imagery. The best known example, of course, is the famous Trultalum sun disk. This was found in 1902 in a peat bog, and I think it was in 1962, an archaeologist named Hans Drescher was the first to point out that the gold-plated side of this famous disc is mounted in such a fashion that it's drawn, as you can see, from left to right, from east to west. And when you reverse the image of the sun chariot, the back of the disc, which was never gilded and remained simply bronze, represents, it would seem, the sun's journey in the reverse direction, under the land or under the sea, to its rebirth in the east. This sort of sun cycle has now been identified by Fleming Call on a series of bronze razors, also in the Nordic Bronze Age. And here you can just see two examples. It's a similar cyclical story. On one of these, number one there, a solar boat is seen traveling from left to right. It contains two figures that may well be twin solar deities. Then, on another example, number two there, you have a boat without a solar symbol traveling in the opposite direction, followed by a fish. And according to Call, this is a ship of the night and the underworld, and such left-sailing vessels, when they can be identified in Denmark, never contain solar symbols. You can see that the solar boat here is a boat with horses' heads. It's a reflection, like on the Trundalum disc, of the sacral nature of the horse in this part of the Bronze Age, in this part of the world. But horse heads were replaced by birds' heads in the 12th or 13th century, and this continued into the Iron Age. And very briefly, the decoration, for example, on the Vienna situla, a bronze bucket in private collections in Central Europe, studied by Stefan Wirth. It's essentially consists, as you can see, it's number 2 there, of rows of sun ships sailing around the circumference of the vessel, one above the other. And Stefan Wirth thinks in its mirror imagery, this evokes the sun's journey above and below the horizon. And as he points out, this is a cosmological narrative that recalls the celestial and the otherworldly voyages of the sun. And it's possible that other sorts of representations of the sun on these vessels contain abbreviated versions of this complex cosmological belief. For example, in certain cases, as on number 1 there, a Hungarian vessel, the central image is, as you can see, a very clear solar boat. The solar disk has birds' heads on either side. But then there are interned birds' heads with smaller bosses, and this is possibly an abbreviated version of this cosmic story. I would suggest that these opposed or reversed birds are intended to denote the nocturnal otherworld voyage of the sun. Inverted boats may actually tell a similar story. And there are examples of these to be found both in Scandinavian rock art and indeed on bronze vessels, boats placed, keel to keel, one above the other. A journey to the other world is also possibly represented in the small bronze discs that decorated the famous wagon in the burial at Vix, which I'll have more to say about in a later lecture, because here in the bottom illustration you can see two of these bronze discs. There's clearly a solar disc with birds' heads above and below the solar symbol. The last voyage of the high status woman who was buried here is probably reflected in this solar symbolism. It's also found, by the way, on Torques in the Marne region in northern France in the La Tène period. And moving to these islands, the same sort of solar symbolism and the same allusion to celestial and otherworldly voyages of the sun occurs on a series of discs in Ireland. It's most easily seen on the famous Petrie crown, now in the National Museum in Dublin and named after the antiquarian George Petrie, who unfortunately didn't record its provenance. But as you can see, the right-hand disc below the one surviving of a pair of horns on this sheet bronze object, you have a very clear representation of a solar boat with stylized birds' heads, and then in the center of the boat there is a solar disc. The disc on the left is more puzzling. It appears to have an inverted boat, but again the birds' heads, albeit rather stylized, are still clearly visible. Various people, when they studied this object in the past, saw sort of traces of a human face here, and the solar symbolism remained effectively unrecognized, though it was pointed out many years ago by Sprokov in a paper in the 1950s. The same is true of a series of bronze discs about which we have very little information, other than at least two of them were found in pairs. One is a pair from Monasterevin, and one is another pair possibly from County Armagh. But once again, these aren't, as some people have suggested, great staring faces or even grotesque fish designs. These are in effect highly stylized solar symbols once again. And the pairing is extremely interesting because, as you can see, on the left you have the outward turned birds' heads at either end, the prow and stern of the solar boat containing the solar symbol. But then the other element of the pair has the in-turned birds' heads, suggesting, I think, the nocturnal voyage of the sun. I think the pairing is highly significant. We have here a complex cosmological tale reflected in much the same way as it was shown on the Trundholm sun disk over 1,000 years before. Objects such as these are normally dated to the 1st century BC, 1st century AD. They could well be a little later. But in fact, this symbolism also finds expression in some very fine Iron Age metalwork in Britain. The most obvious example, I suppose, is the famous Battersea shield, which has in the upper and lower roundels inversion and normal representation, as you can see. The lower roundel there has a highly stylized solar boat with a solar disk in the center, and the upper roundel in this complex piece is an inverted version of the same. This solar imagery, I think, continues into the famous artwork of the Iron Age mirrors, studied so comprehensively by Jody Joy. And I think, again, what we're witnessing here is a deliberate attempt to conceal the solar imagery and perhaps to mystify it in some way. But I have no doubt that it was very familiar to those who gazed on these objects. And here again we have an expression, I think, of a cosmographical belief that was widespread in ancient Europe. It is true to say, of course, that it only surfaces in different places at different times. Denmark, Central Europe, Ireland and Britain, Bronze Age, Iron Age. But we shouldn't expect a belief like this to be reflected in every aspect of the archaeological record in every geographical region. What's interesting here, I think, is the sheer longevity of the concept. We have a theme, the celestial, diurnal and nocturnal voyage of the sun, reflected in different ways over a period of 2,000 years. It's a complex pre-literate cosmology that takes us from Trundhullum to the ever-new tongue in 9th century Ireland, and indeed, I suppose, to the voyage of the Icora even later. And the late Iron Age Petrie crown and the Battersea shield are just two objects that show the persistence of this model right to the early centuries AD. I wonder if the author of the ever-new tongue, albeit in a literate Christian context, realized he was reiterating a theory of the otherworld journey of the sun that in one form or another was a widespread one and certainly as old as the Bronze Age. In fact, I think it may well have been current in Newgrange when the mystery of the sun's reappearance from the otherworld was celebrated there at the Wilster at the winter solstice. Now, I know we have ranged rather widely, but we've been trying to answer O'Kelly's question. Could aspects of a Neolithic people's beliefs and practices survive for thousands of years to be embedded in medieval texts? Taking the disparate strands of evidence together, protracted veneration and usage of tombs like altar, the mnemonic capacity of enduring monuments like the inviolate Newgrange, still a place to remember of potent magic in the 12th century, the longevity of cosmological concepts like this solar story that I've spelled out, the historical robustness of the oral traditions of the Tlingit people in faraway Alaska. I think the answer has to be now a qualified yes to O'Kelly's question, which means we can now look, I hope, a little more confidently at the references in other tales to the other world, to sacral kings, to goddesses of sovereignty, and they will be the targets of the next few lectures. Thank you very much.